I would probably take an average 1-2 grinder playing his A game over an average 25-50 grinder playing his C game any day.
You're listening to the Mindset Advantage podcast. Each week, you'll get to peek inside the greatest minds in the game and discover what makes them successful.
Mental toughness separates those that can't handle the stress.
If you're going to treat it like an amateur, you're probably going to have amateur results.
Now here's your host, Elliot Rowe.
Hey, Elliot Rowe here. I'm very excited to announce that for the next few episodes, Stephen Baker will be guest hosting the show. Stephen has experience both as a professional poker player, strategic coach, and now a member of my mindset performance coaching world. I can confidently say that Stephen's one of the world's leading experts in poker mindset and performance, and I'm really excited to hear the conversations he has with some fantastic guests. And with that, here's Stephen.
Welcome to the Mindset Advantage podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Baker. My guest on today's podcast is Dara O'Kearney. Dara is a well-known professional tournament player. Over and above that, Dara produces excellent poker content, both podcasting and also in a series of books. Up to this point, the books have been largely focused on GTO play. But his most recent book is called Beyond GTO. As the name implies, he's looking to go beyond game theory optimal play. And in the book, he explores exploitative strategies. One of the interesting things about going in this direction is it produces particular mindset challenges for the players who've learned GTO and feel less comfortable moving in an exploitative direction. So in today's podcast, we're going to look at some of the things that Dara sets out in the book and some of the mindset challenges. So without further ado, let's go and hear what Dara has to say. Well, Dara, welcome. Great to see you. Thank you for being here. I expect you've been pretty busy. I think I saw you've been in Paris recently for EPT. How did that go, first of all?
It went very well. I was only there for the first week. I didn't stay for the EPT main event itself. I decided I was going to go for 1 week, and I didn't decide which one until I played a few satellites and stars. I won a satellite to the 1K, so that made my decision for me. I played 3 tournaments there. I cashed all 3, and I actually got third in the first 1K, which was not the big 1K, but it was an opener event. But still, it was my biggest score in quite a few years. So it was good. I've been in good recent live form, and I actually attribute a lot of that to the work I did on the latest book, which got me thinking more exploitatively. At the grand old age of, what age am I now? 58. I suddenly find myself on top of the Irish live rankings again on GPI. Very temporarily, I'm sure, but yeah, it's been a good start to the year. This is my third final table. I won a side event at IPT Galway as well. So at the moment, I'm feeling very good about live poker.
That's good. Well, with some justification. Well, in fact, let's just take a step back, and for people who are not so familiar with you, just can you take us from the beginning, to, how you first got into poker, how you became a professional, and then maybe just take us through, sort of some key points along that journey.
Yeah, I guess I started poker way later than most people. I learned the game shortly before my 42nd birthday. I think it might have been part of a midlife crisis, but at the time I was working as an IT consultant. I wasn't very happy at what I was doing. Didn't really enjoy it. I was also winding down a running career, which had been quite successful. I was Irish 24-hour champion. I won a few other big ultra marathons like New York. But I was conscious of the fact that I was sort of coming to the end of that at the age of 42. I've always been a really competitive person. I've always had something that I wanted to do really at a high level competitively. The first example was chess. I was obsessed with chess in my teens. I played it. I won chess tournaments, and then in my early 20s, I kind of realized I was never going to be a grandmaster, and that I had plateaued. And then I kind of lost interest in chess. It was like, well, now I'm as good as I'm ever going to be. similar thing with bridge. I took up bridge after chess, played that at a very high level as well, backgammon, and then I got into the running. And as the running was winding down, I was thinking like there needs to be something else I can do that isn't just golf or lawn bowls or anything or any of the other stuff that old people traditionally move to. And I was watching TV one night and I saw the Irish Poker Open on TV here in Ireland, and there were all sorts of shapes and sizes and, more importantly, ages on display. And I realized, well, this is clearly a game where age is not as big a factor against you. It's probably still something of a factor. You know, most of the top players are young, but it does seem to be possible to operate at a high level. So I thought, okay, I'll get into poker. And then I had a long-term plan. I thought, well, maybe by the age of 50, I'll be able to play at a high level and, you know, take part in stuff like the Irish Open. It actually happened a lot quicker. I have a fairly obsessive personality. So once I got into poker, like I really got into it. I was playing every day. I was thinking about poker all the time, really grinding online. I had a lot of downtime at the time in my job. So, you know, between meetings and stuff, I was just grinding online poker, thinking about online poker. And pretty quickly, it got to the stage where I was making more money from playing online than I was from my day job. So within about a year or so, I transitioned. There was a transition period where I was still doing both, obviously, but I was winding down my IT consultancy and doing more and more poker. So by the end of 2009, I was pretty much a full-time professional poker player, and I have been ever since.
Great. So as we're the Mindset Advantage podcast, one question I often ask guests on the podcast is about the mental game and particular challenges you might have met along your journey, because it's now, you know, you're now a professional for what? That means 15 plus years. Have there been some big mental game challenges, and how have you addressed those along the way?
Yeah, I think one of the advantages of coming into poker later than most people is that I had learned a lot of mindset stuff from the other things that I'd done, from chess, from backgammon, and especially from running, oddly enough. Like in running, you just focus on your own performance and you don't worry about stuff that's outside your control, like what your competitors are doing or what the weather's like or even how you're feeling on the day. You just kind of accept it and get on with it. And I think that's a good starting mindset for poker. Yeah. Just focus on what you can control and don't worry about the uncontrollables. So I think I had a bit of a head start there, but there were certainly some challenges. I mean, I think the common one, I think almost everybody goes through this, is you just really don't understand variance at the start of your career. I ran very well for the first year or two, and I think a lot of professional players did. If they had run badly in that period, they probably would have stopped. But running good is a huge help at that point of your career, but it can't last forever. And I do remember maybe 2 years in, I started to have my first real downswing, and that was challenging. It was like, wait a minute, it's actually possible to lose playing poker as well. Nobody warned me about this. So that was the first major challenge. I also remember my first Vegas went really badly, and I came back from it. And I was used to, again, I had run really well live. Like I literally won the first big tournament that I entered, the European Deep Stack, and had a great first year. I went over to Vegas full of hope and thinking it was going to be the same, and it wasn't. And when I came back from there, I had to tell my wife how much money I lost, and it was a shock. She was on a learning curve as well, because her whole experience in poker was just me saying, yeah, last month I won this month I won this much, and so on. And now she had to be mentally prepared for downswings as well. So I was talking to a friend of mine, a professional player at the time, an English gentleman by the name of Mark Dallimore. And Mark said, well, I'll tell you what you do. Take half the money you've made from poker and put it in some really safe investment. And then your wife will, that'll give her peace of mind. So I did that. Unfortunately, the safe investment I chose was not safe. It was a bank stock called Anglo-Irish Bank, which literally went to zero over the course of the next year. So at the same time as I was having my first big downswing, I also saw half my bankroll disappear in this supposedly very safe investment. So that was also challenging. But I think I think I was lucky that I came into poker late and I had been sort of battle weary and hardened from the other endeavors. So most of the skills that I had learned from there transferred across pretty well to poker. Just being fairly stoical in general, and then the more I played, the better understanding I got of variance in general, and just realized, well, this is part of the job, and actually this is a vital part of poker, because if there was no variance, the losing players would just lose all the time and they'd stop playing.
Exactly.
It's not for nothing that people won't challenge chess grandmasters to chess matches for lots of money. They know they're going to lose every time.
Exactly. Yeah. You have to basically, as a professional, see downswings as part of your marketing cost, and everybody basically contributes to it, because you're right. There will be no professional there'll be it'd be like professional chess, right? Good players playing good players for exhibition money, I suppose, effectively. But what's the point if you lose every time as a recreational player? So yeah, absolutely. So no, that's fantastic. So let's just talk, because you've touched on your book, and I want to talk about this now because it does have a mindset element. Your book is called Beyond GTO: Poker Exploits Simplified. But before we started, we were having a brief chat, and I was actually saying that from my own experience, I went through a phase as a professional player of being deeply schooled in GTO, and it actually felt uncomfortable to move towards a much more exploitative strategy. Like most people, I mean, I started at a similar time to you, I think, 2008, and there wasn't as much material, and there certainly weren't solvers at that time. But then when they came out, I completely embraced them. And then it felt uncomfortable moving away from some of the strategies they use. And this is where your book's really, really interesting. And I just want to read out a little bit, just for everybody listening and watching. And then we'll just have a little talk about it, because this in a way is the mission statement of the book, but it also touches on a mindset issue. And you say this: a successfully executed exploitative strategy will make more money on average against a weak opponent than a GTO strategy. However, when your reads are wrong, you leave yourself open to being counter-exploited, meaning you might actually lose money overall. Some players, therefore, prefer to take the guesswork out of poker by playing as close to GTO as they can. And that, to me, encapsulates the discomfort of many players who are trained in GTO. It's like, it feels safe. I know I'm not capable of being exploited if I use this strategy. But then I get really good players who understand, but that's a mistake because the population doesn't play like the solver, so I need to adjust. But even at a subconscious level, they find themselves, for example, calling with bluff catchers, which actually in certain spots just don't make sense against the kind of players they're playing. So yeah, I'd like you to just talk about that and talk about how the mindset element plays into some of the things you talk about in the book.
Yeah, I feel we're very much kindred spirits on this, because for me, the solvers were a real game changer. One of my biggest frustrations with poker early on was just how difficult it was to get good information. And, if I had a difficult spot, typically what I did was I asked the 5 best players I knew. Often I got 5 different opinions, and then I had to decide which opinion I put the most weight on. And then the solvers came along, and you could program them, put in, this is my range, this is my opponent's range, this is how I think they play, now what should I have done? And the solver can give you an exact answer. And I found that very useful, but also very comforting, which itself sort of became a problem down the line. A lot of players, I think, enjoy the comfort of, like, they're not sure about a spot, they put it through GTO Wizard or PO or whatever, and then the solver says, yeah, that's fine, what you did there, that was a good bluff catch on the river or whatever, and then they leave it at that and they sort of pat themselves on the back. But that's solvers. So I think solvers are by far the most important thing that have happened to poker over the course of our careers, and the vast majority of players who are operating at the top level, most of their knowledge comes from solvers these days. But you also have to understand the limitations of solvers. First of all, they're incomplete solutions. they're as close as we can get with the computers. They're also based on whatever assumptions we or whoever programmed the sim put in at the start, and then it also depends on what our opponents are actually doing. Like, I have a lot of students who they want to run a spot, and I'll run it for them, and they'll say, okay, so that was a good call I made on the river. And then I'll show them, well, yeah, it was if the guy is betting this range, which is what the solver thinks. Do you really think they're finding these bottom of range bluffs here? Do you really think they're thin value betting second pair or third pair, which the solver is doing? The solvers have now advanced to the stage where through node locking, you can go in and determine, or you can tell the solver, okay, forget GTO, this is what my opponent's actually doing, so what should my response be? But a lot of people still aren't using that, which was one of the motivations for doing the book. But to answer your broader question, this is a whole conversation I've had going on years now with Andy Black, who is probably the major exponent in Ireland of the exploitative strategy. And on our podcast, The Chip Race, we did a piece last year, which we dubbed GTO versus White Magic, with obviously me in the GTO corner and Andy in the White Magic corner. And over the course of our conversation, we kind of realized that we had a lot more in common with each other. But I had a couple of flaws in my mindset as well. And the big one was I was very uncomfortable deviating too far into exploitative territory, because if I got it wrong, it felt terrible. It just felt like I made a major mistake. And taking the safe GTO play was mentally more reassuring or comforting to me, because I could go off and I could have the solver tell me that I made the right play. But the point Andy managed to get across to me was that even the best exploitative players in the world don't get it right 100%. You're not aiming for 100%. In the same way that when you thin value bet the river, or when you value bet the river, you're not expecting that bet to win 100% of the time when it's called. In fact, if your value bets always win on the river, then you're just not value betting enough. It means you're not value betting thin enough. Your value bets only have to win slightly over half the time for it to be a good bet. And the same is true in this area. Your exploitative reads and your deviations only have to be good slightly over half the time for it to actually help your win rate. And there is no certainty. Sometimes you will think, okay, this player is incapable of bluffing, so I'm going to fold my bluff catcher, and they'll surprise you. I think we saw that on the most recent EPT final table, where Barney Boatman pulled a few high wire bluffs, and his opponents just didn't think he was capable. And then later on, ironically, when presumably they watched back and saw that he had bluffed in certain spots, they started calling him down too much. And this is why players don't like to deviate, because you can get it wrong, and it feels really bad when you get it wrong. But you just have to accept that that's the price of you have to pay for trying to unlock those extra profits you get from deviating from GTO.
Yeah, exactly. You got to accept that ultimately we're playing a game of probabilities, not certainty, and that means that sometimes you'll make, in quotes, the right decision, but it just won't work out very well. It's interesting what you said, that you've used the word a couple of times in that description, comfort, and the human mind the brain wants to be comfortable. It wants to be safe, and effectively, often taking the safe option is what it will do. And it's I come across this all the time, and this includes with really good players who end up clinging to GTO in spots where they know rationally they should abandon it, and that's why they come to me. They'll say, "Hey, I keep making these decisions in this spot, but because it feels comfortable." But then I end up being wrong, and that's the trouble. There is a price. There is a price for not pulling the trigger, the exploitative trigger, as well. That's the thing. Sometimes that price is hidden, but it's a price nonetheless. Yeah. So let's look into a couple of the spots, if that's okay, Dara. Let's just talk about something which I think is very much part of the old school live play sort of wisdom. And you actually say the old school wisdom of playing tight against fish is being turned on its head. And when we go through the book, I won't give away all the book in this podcast, but there's quite a lot of examples of this. And I just, maybe if you'd like to just talk a little bit about that idea and just maybe flesh it out with an example?
Yeah, the old school idea of fish is that they're calling stations, so you shouldn't bluff them, and therefore you should just have the best hand and value bet it. But first of all, that's a gross oversimplification. They may call too much, but that doesn't mean they're always calling. There are certain boards, for example, where, against a fish who likes to chase all the draws, if all the obvious draws miss, flush draws, straight draws, etc., they're just going to have, king high, queen high draw, ace high draw a lot of the time, and they will fold that. And then there are other spots where on certain boards, there are no draws possible and they just don't have any unmade hand. And yeah, they'll frustrate you by calling you down bottom pair, but you just kind of have to accept that that's the case. So recognizing what the good bluffing opportunities are, it has nothing to do with GTO really. It has everything to do with what's actually going to call me and what can I get to fold if I do bluff. And the thing is, we found time and time again in the book, as we went into different leaks. This book started with me just giving Barry a list of what I thought were the most common leaks I saw live players make. And then we went off and we node locked with the solvers to see how the solver would exploit those leaks. And time again, what the solver does is, if a player has a certain type of leak in some part of the game tree, it just gets them into that part of the game tree more often to allow them to make that mistake. And that's the way the best live exploitative players exploit fish. They just play more hands against them, allow them to make more mistakes, and then take advantage of those mistakes. If somebody doesn't check raise, if somebody doesn't 3-bet you enough pre-flop, you can just open more hands, because a lot of the hands that you can't open, the reason you can't open them is if you get 3-bet, now you have too many hands that have to fold to the 3-bet. But if you're not getting 3-bet at anything like the correct frequency, then you can just open all those extra hands. And similarly, if they don't check raise you enough on the flop when they've defended their big blinds, now you can bet a lot of hands that you wouldn't bet in GTO because they don't want to get check raised. But you can bet them now because you're less worried about getting check raised. And conversely, when you have value, when you have a very strong hand, which you would like to get check raised with, but you're not going to get check raised very often by this player, then just use the bigger size yourself. Put the chips in yourself. Don't allow them to put the chips in if they're not going to do it for you. And those are, as I said, that was the big takeaway from us we got from the book. If somebody's making a mistake, allow them to make that mistake as much as possible, and just take advantage of the mistake.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And for those, who are thinking about buying the book, I'd highly recommend it, because again, if you've come from a GTO background, what you do, Dara, in the book is you actually prove to these people that what you're saying is correct. You actually, run the node locks and say, hey, here's the output from the solver. And again, I think, what's great about it is it doesn't get bogged down in the detail. It gives you the big takeaways, which, it's easy to take away a heuristic from each of the chapters. And there's chapters on pre-flop play, players who call too much, players who overfold. Everything you've ever encountered in a live tournament, it's there. The over-aggressive check raiser, which is relatively unusual, but the guy who doesn't check raise, which is much more usual. And it's all proved. It's not just assumptive. It's actually proved through the solver. Quite a challenge, though, I imagine. I mean, you identified the problem with solvers that actually, to really, really drill down, you can't just node lock one street, right? You've got to, often the players' faults mean that you have to node lock multiple streets, or at least look at the output and say, well, wait a minute, how will that output be affected by the other leaks these players got?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. When you're looking at turn and river leaks, you can't just node lock the turn or river. You also have to node lock what you think they're doing on the flop. Because what will happen is, if you just node lock the river, for example, is the solver will go back and adjust to the turn and flop strategies as well as it can to minimize that leak, which the player is not doing. So you absolutely have to make sure that you're node locking for all of their tendencies. And that was challenging. It's heartening to hear your reaction, because when I started this book, in my mind, there were two distinct audiences. There were the GTO disciples, for want of a better word, who, similar to me actually, were kind of suspicious of exploitative poker, and needed to have it proven to them. And my thinking was, well, the way we'll prove it to them is we'll show them that actually, if you program the solver to how people are actually playing, then the solver will give you a very different output from GTO. And I think we definitely managed to achieve what we wanted to with that demographic. The second demographic were people who just were suspicious of solvers and GTO in general, and thought it was all hocus pocus. And that I thought that was going to be a more challenging crowd to appeal to, because obviously we did use solvers to prove our work in the book. But actually, the reaction from that crowd has been really good too. It's almost like we've shown them why the solvers are useful now, rather, because they always had this suspicion of like, yeah, well, the solver's saying call with this bluff catcher, but the person is never bluffing, so this is nonsense. Now they kind of understand better that, well, that's because the solver is being asked to produce a certain type of output against a perfect opponent, which we're not playing against. And if we change the inputs, the outputs will change dramatically, and that gels much more with the way they view poker. The person whose reaction I was most nervous about, I guess, was Andy Black, because I had talked to Andy a lot about this stuff, and I sent him the book to see what he thought. And part of me was thinking he was going to come back and say like, this is still a load of nonsense. But actually, it was the opposite. He was completely blown away and completely convinced that this is the correct way to think, to the point that he actually wrote the foreword for the book as well. And we've had other similar types of players who, let's say, were always suspicious of GTO or just don't believe in solvers in general, now coming around to the view of, yeah, well, it's just because the solvers were being used inappropriately, which they definitely were. I mean, people who think that anybody they play against mid-stakes online or low to mid-stakes live is playing like a solver is deluding themselves. The players just don't play like that, and that I think getting those two opposing factions together, the people who don't believe in GTO and the people who believe in it too much, that was the real challenge of the book.
Yeah, no, and you've done it absolutely superbly. And as I say, what's great is, somebody can just dip in as well and say, oh, I came up against this opponent tonight. I think she was doing this. Whatever it may be, check raising, not enough, or inelastic calling ranges. In fact, I'm going to come to that in a second, because I think that's a really interesting case study in the mental aspect of this. And you can just dip into it and see how the adjustments play out when the solver's used, as you say, correctly. Let's just talk about inelastic calling ranges, because I really like that part of the book. And it sort of exemplifies something which can feel very uncomfortable, which is, I think a lot of us, when we are trained in GTO, we project. I think this is true whichever style you play. It's very easy to project your own style of play onto other people. And you end up just reflecting something which isn't there in that player. And one of the things you said about when you see a player with inelastic calling ranges, and just for anyone watching who's not aware of that, it effectively means they don't respond to bet sizing, right? So if you bet big, they'll call just the same as if you bet small. Whereas a proper strategy normally will reflect a theoretically correct strategy will reflect different sizing. And what you say is this: the adjustment is to play our hand face up. When an opponent does not change their strategy based on the size of their bet, we don't need to hide the strength of our hand. And I think for a lot of people, that thinks that they feel like, oh, well, I can't get away with this. This doesn't feel right. But so it's another piece of advice that can feel mentally uncomfortable to a good player. Is that something you experienced and you come across with? Maybe I know you coach. Maybe you've worked with some good players who struggle in that regard.
Yeah, well, I would say it's one of the most common things which comes up, because often when people bring me a hand, and a lot of the time they do just want the reassurance that they played it correctly. But they'll get to the river, and the common one is they'll throw out a bet size that's too small, And they get called, and they pat themselves on the back because they get called. And then I say, well, why didn't you bet bigger? And they say, oh, well, I was afraid the player would fold. And then you ask them, well, okay, what hands do you think they would have folded to the bigger size that they wouldn't fold to the smaller size? And often there's very little difference between the two. So once you interrogate them on their reasoning, then they start to see, oh yeah, I could have actually got away with betting twice as much, and I was getting called almost as often. And the EV of that is obviously higher than the smaller bet size. Or sometimes you turn it around and say to them, okay, well, why didn't you just bet 2x pot on the river? And then they go, well, then they're never calling. And then I'll say, okay, so if you got there with nothing, you were going to 2x pot, right? And they go, well, no, because I'd be afraid they might call. So people do this retrospective thing depending on whether they want to fold or a call, where they think, well, if I bet really big as a bluff, that doesn't feel right because they might call. But if I bet really big for value, they might fold, and I don't want that either. And it's like, which is it? It has to be one or the other. And yeah, it is very common. Like we're wired to be naturally conservative and nitty and lock up small wins. And there's all these studies which show that people won't change job for extra money. But if you reduce their salary by the same amount, now they'll change job because losses feel worse than gains. And you have to fight against that all the time as a poker player. You just have to try and force yourself to make the highest EV decisions and interrogate yourself. Like, ask yourself, like, when you get to the river, okay, my gut is saying bet half pot, but like, if I bet pot, how many more extra hands are going to call? If I bet 2x pot, similarly, if you're bluffing, like, how many more hands are going to fold? So just to get out of the sort of tried and tested, always bet 2/3 pot on the river, always bet 1/3 pot on the flop, and just really focus on what calls and what folds. And a lot of live bears do have, not entirely inelastic ranges, but almost entirely. They're going to call almost all the same hands to half pot and pot. They'll probably call a few more hands if you 10% pot it. But you should always be asking yourself, like, what does my hand want here? Does it want to maximize value? In which case, what's the biggest size that I can go for? Or am I bluffing? And what size will make for a profitable bluff? A lot of people apply GTO but don't understand the math of GTO, and that's, once you understand the math of GTO and then you understand that your opponent is deviating from that anyway, then the whole thing breaks down, and you have to think purely exploitatively. Like, if you pot it on the river as a bluff, it only needs to work half the time. If you bet half pot, if the guy is not let's say the guy is not folding half the time, well then half pot for value never makes sense, because half pot for value, even if he calls 95%, the EV of that is 45% of pot, whereas the EV of potting it has to be more than 50% if he's not folding 50%. So people need to sort of go back to basics on that stuff and think about EV in basic terms rather than just in terms of solver output.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about, you touched on something interesting there, and that is the tendency of the human mind to want to just lock up small wins and feel good about itself. I just wanted to touch on one final section in your book about the opponent who is too concerned about tournament life. And I work with a lot of pros, and this isn't such an issue for them, but I do also work with people who are very serious recreational players. Often they've got good jobs, and they want some coaching on the mindset side. And one of the most common, in quotes, small wins that they like to lock up is surviving to day 2. The amount of people who say, oh yeah, I made it to day 2. It goes up on their Instagram or whatever. And this is a real common thing. And it's one of the first things I find myself tackling time and again. Well, okay, look, it depends what your goals are as a recreational player, but pretty well everybody who's coming to me is wanting to play well, wanting to go for the win. Yeah. And it's plausible as a good recreational player to go for the win. But like that mindset of, I just want to see day 2 so I can tell my friends or go home to my wife and say, I didn't bust out on day one, is actually a big obstacle. Tell us a little bit about that one and you know, how that one plays out in terms of what you say in the book.
That's you're right. That is a very, very common one among recreationals, to the point that, like, most professionals know they should be trying to exploit that. There are even telltale signs of who's already locked up, like the guy who's counting his chips 20 minutes from the end. That's the amount he's hoping to put into the bag. He doesn't want to put those chips to work. And I think we talked about this in the ICM book more than the latest book, because in the ICM book, obviously there's a lot of talk about bubbles, but day one, unless it's a tournament where everybody gets paid at the end of day one, which is a thing now, but most tournaments aren't. Most of the big ones aren't. Bubble goes on day 2 or day 3. So we refer to it as an emotional bubble, and that's what it is, because people don't want that sort of bad feeling of having played all day and then busting right at the end, and then they have to go home and they bust and they don't get to put a picture up on Instagram of their bag and all that stuff, and that makes them super exploitable in that period. They basically turn into the players in Beyond GTO that we describe as just being far too tight, and you just want to play far more hands against them and push them around a lot more, push them out of their comfort zone, and that you know, you will see guys who like try and play almost every hand the last hour with professionals, because if it'll work at a table of recreations who are all, you know, looking at their hand and they're actually hoping to see 7 deuce so they can just fold and not have to feel bad about it. But even if they find something marginal, like, you know, ace queen or pocket sevens, they might actually throw it away as well, because they just don't want to get involved near the end of play. And I do actually hear sometimes recreationals say, when they hear about bust outs late in the day, "Oh, I should have just folded, so there was only 3 more hands to go and make day 2." There's no prizes for making day 2.
Exactly.
Unless there are, of course, but in most tournaments there aren't. So it really is just an emotional bubble, and one of the things poker forces you to do is not act on your emotions. You need to be conscious of them, obviously. We're all human beings. We can't suppress our emotions, but you know, you need to, when that little voice in the back of your head is going like, yeah, this guy has raised the last six hands. We have ace queen. It's an obvious 3-bet, but it's the last hand of the night and I don't want to get involved. So maybe we should just fold. To recognize where that's coming from, and override it. Be prepared to override it. We have all these cognitive biases which are constantly in play. And the most important non-poker book I read for my poker game was Thinking Fast and Slow, because it lists out all the cognitive biases. And when I'm deep in a tournament or when I'm playing live in general, I'm constantly checking myself for these cognitive biases. Because this is another thing, like when you move towards exploitative poker, typically people talk about their gut. Well, my gut was telling me to fold, or my gut was telling me to open this hand, or whatever. And you know, a lot of the time that's legitimate, that you have some sort of subconscious information that you're not consciously processing, but your subconscious is communicating it to you. Well, this person never bluffs, so just fold already. Or actually this person, even though they bet and probably has a strong hand, doesn't want a big confrontation. So if you raise, there's a good chance they'll fold. So a lot of the times it is good, but a lot of the times it can be just a cognitive bias as well. It can be, well, I just lost a big pot and I don't want to lose another big pot, or I just lost a big pot and I'm desperate to get my chips back. So my gut is trying to force me in some direction based on what has just happened or what is just about to happen at the end of the day. And then sort of go, okay, well, now I know why I'm feeling that, so I'm happier to override it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for anybody listening, if they think they haven't got cognitive biases, that they need to think again. Thinking Fast and Slow is really a study in how we all have those biases. And I think the starting point has to be the self-awareness that you've got them. And then I think where your book really fits in here is it gives you an alternative heuristic. Basically what our brain will use under pressure is heuristics, because the brain tries to save energy. What we all like to think our brain does is be completely rational. I'm going to use a really logical heuristic, but its default software is full of cognitive and emotional biases. And what you've got to do is effectively install new software. And that's exactly where this comes in, because it's saying, okay, in this spot, this is the program you should use. And effectively, here we have in a number of chapters a nice way of thinking about the things you'll commonly come across, particularly in live poker, but also online poker just as much, to be honest with you. And I know the standard is generally dollar for dollar higher in online poker, but you witness all the same things. So it's really fantastic in that regard. So I want to just from there, Dara, just ask you a little bit about what the future holds for you. Where do you go from here? What's your vision? What are your goals from here?
Yeah. Well, when I talked about how I got into poker, that got us up to the early years, and through the difficult early years where I had to deal with sort of my first major downswing and stuff. Over the last, I guess, 8 or 9 years, content creation has become a much bigger part of what I've done. This is my 6th book with Barry. I also make the Chip Race podcast with David. We're lucky enough to be sponsored by Unibet on that front. I make training content. I do training for jackercoaching.com. I do quite a lot of other writing as well. So that's become a much bigger part, and that's likely to continue. This isn't the last book I'm doing with Barry. We're not sure what the next one will be yet. We're kicking around a number of different ideas, and we've preliminary started work on 3 different books, but and we'll just see how that goes. The response to the books has been amazing, and that's been really heartening. Not just the sales, but just the number of readers who tell us that they got immense value out of the books, and it really made them fall in love with poker again, which is really, that was the sort of hidden agenda of what we wanted to do. We wanted to make people, show them the beauty of the game. Poker is sold usually in one of 2 ways, either as a strategy game or a gambling game. And a lot of people are just attracted by the gambling, and that's obviously fine. But and they often think the strategy is boring. That's the boring stuff they have to learn to be able to gamble. But I think when you get into the strategy, it's such a beautiful game, and there's so much to think about, and it's completely unsolvable. And you are always just scratching the surface, but you can always get better, and it does reward hard work. So producing content which helps explain that to people, how beautiful the game is when you understand it strategically, and how it's not actually work to try and figure it out. It's like a giant puzzle. That's kind of the main mission. I'm still a very active player as well. I play primarily online, and I do still prefer online poker to live poker, but I like playing a certain amount of live poker as well. So the rest of this year I'll play European Deep Stack is coming up here in Ireland soon. That tournament has a special place in my heart because it was my first big tournament, and which I won and basically announced myself on the live poker stage. Irish Open after that is always a highlight, and WSOP as well. I'll be going to that probably before the WSOP. I'll go to a tournament in Portugal, the Portugal Adventure, run by the same people who run the Irish Poker Tour. So there's quite a lot of live poker planned, and also keep grinding online, keep doing the coaching. Keep creating the content that we create. That's sort of, I like doing lots of different things, because then if there's one area which isn't going great at any particular point, I can just shift my attention to another area until I'm feeling it. If I'm having a downswing online, I can cut back maybe my online sessions and concentrate on the other stuff for a while. So that sort of keeps it fresh for me. I've been playing for almost 20 years now, and I still absolutely love the game. And that's the most important thing to me, to maintain that passion. I never wanted to just be a job that I have to get up and do every day. So long as I keep enjoying what I do, I'll keep doing it.
Well, thank you. I mean, you're extremely busy. You are producing great content. And by the way, for anybody watching, listening, in the show notes for today, I'm going to give you a link for your website, Dara, so that people can find out how to, buy your books, see your content, listen to your content. And well, I just want to say thank you very much. Really, you're a busy man, and I really appreciate you carving out some time in your schedule to fit us in. Thanks again.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks to Elliot, who I've spoken to before on the podcast back when he did it. I think you guys do great work in the mindset area. We've actually had specific mental game chapters in some of our earlier books. The only reason we didn't put it into this one is we felt we were just repeating a lot of the same stuff over and over again. But from the start, we have acknowledged just how important the mindset stuff is. It's absolutely vital. I have seen players who were brilliant technically, but they failed ultimately because of mindset issues. And I've seen other players carve out very good careers without ever being that good technically, just because they're very strong mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again. And maybe look forward to bringing you back on when you produce your next book, or maybe have your next big win. But thanks again, Dara.
Cheers. Thanks, Stephen.
So thanks again to Dara for sharing his time and his thoughts generously in what's an extremely busy schedule. The links for his book and also the other resources from Dara are in the show notes. And as always, I want to thank you for joining me here on the Mindset Advantage podcast, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again, and goodbye.
You've been listening to the Mindset Advantage podcast. To get future episodes delivered to you automatically, make sure to subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcasting service. To get any resources mentioned in the episode or to listen to past shows, visit pokermindcoach.com/TMA podcast. Thanks for listening.